Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's lecture, where we are beginning to discuss the various labels that are used to describe the Chicano Latino population, which our readings for this week touched on at some length. So I'd like to start out with defining what the various terms are that are used for this population. Often students, that's one of the main questions that a lot of students often have is, what is the difference between Hispanic, Chicano, Latinx? What does it all mean? How do people identify? So I'm starting out with defining some of these terms. You saw the authors talk about these terms as well from their own perspectives. And we will see throughout the course how different authors talk about their identities in relation to, to these labels. So the first one that we often hear is the term Hispanic. Hispanic was created by the Office of Budget and Management in 1977 for the census. It includes people from Spain and is often perceived as representing the assimilated middle class of this population. It's often used for marketing purposes. And one of the key critiques, as you see depicted in this image, is that it lumps all Latinx cultures and histories together, essentially erasing their uniqueness. A more recent term is Latino, and it has gone through various iterations with Latino/A, X, and E. So this was a grassroots term created by the population itself. It only includes people from Latin America who have roots in Latin America and not Spain. The Latino/A began to be used as a way to include women. Latinx, the X was added as a way to create a gender-neutral and inclusive term. Others use Latine instead of the X because the E fits Spanish grammar more easily than the X. Now, similarly, there are questions about what does the term Chicano mean? And the term originally came from the movement of the 1960s, and it was a politicized term that connected people to the Chicano movement of that time period. It was created by the youth of the Mexican-American community. It recognizes that Mexican-Americans have a colonized history within the United States, dating back to 1848 when Mexico lost the war with the United States and subsequently lost what is today the Southwest. The O, A, and X have been added over time for gender inclusivity as well. There are also other terms that are used by Mexican Americans, often dependent on generation, region, experience, and so on. So Mexican American refers to anyone of Mexican descent born and raised in the United States. Mexican is usually used by immigrants who were born and or raised in Mexico. Tejano refers to a Mexican or Mexican American from Texas. Hispano is a term that is often used in New Mexico by those who are descendants of Mexicans or Spaniards from the colonial era. So there are vast amounts beyond Latino or Hispanic or Chicano even that are used among this population. And then, of course, there are Latinxes from around the United States that includes other groups from Latin America that are incorporated into this Latinx umbrella term. For instance, there are Puerto Ricans who are born and raised in the United States outside of the island. The term Latinx is not used in Puerto Rico. There are also Cuban Americans, a population that increased significantly after 1959's Castro Revolution. The large population is primarily in South Florida. There are also Central Americans, a population that has increased significantly after 1980 civil wars in that region. The largest population from Central America in the United States is from El Salvador. We have also had quite a number of people coming in more recent years from different South American countries, including from Ecuador, Peru, Colombia, and most recently Venezuela. Now, the reading from Patricia Sabella talks about diversity among Chicanas and Latinas. And in addition to these various labels that are used by the population itself, that depends on region, experience, generation, and so on, there are all these other factors that contribute to the diversity that you will find among Chicanas and Latinas. There is language differences. For example, some people might be Spanish dominant, some people might be English dominant. There are class differences. There are people who are from working class, middle class, upper middle class, and so on. There's a difference in migration history, whether they are the first generation to migrate to the United States, or their parents were, or their fourth generation living in the United States. There are also regional differences, as I mentioned before. There are people who are from Chicago, people who are from California, people who are from Texas. There are more and more Mexican immigrants going to places like New York and the Southeast, areas that have not been necessarily areas that traditionally you would find Mexican immigrants. Those are becoming hubs for that population as well. And so those regional differences also define how people identify themselves and the kinds of experiences that they have. There are also generations in the US. Are you first generation? Are you sixth generation? The reading also talk about racial features and skin color as another marker that creates differences of experience among Chicanas and Latinas, where if you are the darker skinned one in the family, you may have a different experience than your siblings or family members that might have fair skin color. There's also differences in terms of sexuality, right? If you are part of the LGBTQ community and you're a Latina or Chicana, that also kind of colors your experience. There's also religious differences, right? We tend to assume that the Mexican American population is mostly Catholic, but in the last few decades, there has been a Pentecostal rise in Pentecostalism in Latin America, and therefore among the Latino population as well in the United States. Another issue contributing to diversity among this population is their documentation status, right? If you're undocumented, if you're a resident, or if you are a new citizen, or you've been a citizen for a long time. All of that kind of colors the kind of experience that you have as a Chicana or Latina in the United States. And as you may have noticed, I use these terms interchangeably, specifically because not everybody uses one particular term. And so you'll hear me say Chicanx at one point, Latina in another, and it's really my way of acknowledging that none of these terms are set in stone, and that one of the additional diversities among this population is that we don't all call ourselves the same thing. The readings also talked about what are the commonalities among Chicanas and Latinas. One of them is the history of colonization, right? When you look at the history of the United States in relationship to Latin America and the Spanish Caribbean, you see a very common history of US involvement in these countries and influence that results in a colonizing kind of relationship. There's also a common experience of displacement from your land, whether it's the folks who were already in places like California and Texas when it became part of the United States, who were displaced from their land by the incoming settlers, the Puerto Ricans who have been displaced through colonization of their island, Cubans who have been displaced as a result of the communism that had took place there since 1959 and the US relationship to that country, and so on and so forth. So there are experiences of being displaced from a sense of home, a sense of land that is very common among Chicanas and Latinas. Another common experience is that they're often perceived just for their labor. They're only valued in the United States for their labor, while their culture and language is often denigrated. And so there's a common experience of feeling like your culture and your language has been decimated by whether it's the educational system or pressures for assimilation or other kind of experiences. And finally, another thing that unifies a lot of Chicanas and Latinas, regardless of varieties of differences, are common experiences of discrimination. And we'll see many of these come up in the readings that we'll be discussing throughout the semester. The second reading by Ana Castillo, A Countryless Woman, gives us an example of how Chicana writers in particular have been trying to develop their own framework, their own paradigms, their own definitions of how to think about the unique experiences of Latinas and Chicanas, but also in relationship to feminism. And so she in particular defines Chicanas as mestizas or indigenous women. So there's that connection that she makes to that longer roots of history and culture coming from Mexico and its indigenous past. She also connects their experience of labor to other women of color in the United States and also worldwide. So she connects the fact that not only Latinas are exploited for their labor, but they're exploited for their labor in Latin America and in relation to other women throughout the world. She also talks about the invisibility experienced by women outside of their ethnic communities. There's that part where she talks about how when she lived in Chicago, within her ethnic enclave, she felt comfortable, she felt safe, but whenever she went outside of that space, she felt like she was invisible. She's also critical, though, at the same time, of how Latinxes can sometimes tear each other down, in some ways be their own worst enemies. She's critical of the envidia or jealousy among Latinxes who are successful. She's also critical of internalized racism and the lack of consciousness that she sees among Latinxes themselves. She talks about the early feminista, and this will be an interesting thing for us to continue to think about throughout the semester, because she defines the early Chicana feminists as those involved in the Chicano movement of the 1960s and 70s. But we will be looking at women from before this time period who were activists in their own right. And so it'll be interesting to see your thoughts about where does the early feminista actually appear when we look at Chicana or Latina history. She's also critical of white feminist movements, right? This early feminista, this was one of the things that, or one of the ways in which she distinguished herself from the mainstream feminist movement is to be critical of it, to point out the ways in which they kind of have some blind spots when it came to issues of race and so on. These women were also considered sellouts within the Chicano movement for believing in something that many people in the community saw as something that was a white women's thing. And so often Chicanas who brought up feminist issues within the Chicano movement were rejected by the leaders of some of these organizations because they were perceived as sellouts for bringing up feminist issues. She also talks about the issues that they did identify were relevant to them, such as reproductive health and childcare. Now, one of the last parts of the article that she talks about is this concept of Chicanismo. And this is what I mean, where you will find, and we will see throughout the semester, different Chicana writers trying to come up with their own terms, their own language that best captures what it means to be both Latina and feminist. And so this is a quote from the end of her article. On a pragmatic level, the basic premise of Chicanismo is to reconsider behavior long seen as inherent on the Mexican Amerindian woman's character, such as patience, perseverance, industriousness, loyalty to one's clan, and commitment to our children. Contrary to those who don't understand feminism, we do not reject these virtues. These traits, often seen as negative and oppressive to women, may be considered strengths. Simultaneously, as we redefine, not categorically reject, our roles within our families, communities at large, and dominant society, our concientización helps us to be self-confident and assertive regarding the pursuing of our needs and desires. And so what is she saying here? What she's saying is that to be a Chicana feminist or Latina feminist, It doesn't mean that you necessarily completely reject those traditional roles that are expected of Mexican American women, of being, close to their family, nurturing children, and so on. Often it's assumed that if you're a feminist, it means that you're against motherhood, or that you're against certain traditional roles, or that, you are not going to be you don't want to be a wife, you don't want to be cooking, and so on. And so her point is that the role of the Chicana feminist is to look at those roles and not necessarily reject them, but understand them, and redefine them as not as sources of as potential sources of strength. So that motherhood, for example, is not something that is negative or a negative experience for women, but that it can be a source of strength. At the same time, in redefining these roles, women are also becoming self-confident and assertive enough to pursue their own needs and desires, like reproductive health, like making demands for childcare, like having conversations with their spouses about who shares the household chores and so on, who takes care of the kids, right? So it doesn't mean rejecting completely these roles, it means redefining them, and at the same time, developing the skills and the self-confidence to make demands for what is right for you and your life, and the lives of other women. So we'll continue to discuss these kinds of ideas from many of these scholars throughout the semester, and think about how do they relate to many of the women that we're going to be talking about that have been activists throughout different moments in history. So this ends our lecture for this week. I look forward to your thoughts on our discussion posts. Have a wonderful week.